Welcome to the Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. In this episode, I'm in Dallas, Texas, welcoming back to the podcast top retail strategist, best-selling author, and my remarkable retail podcast co-host, Steve Dennis. We're back on the mic together talking about the launch of the second edition of his best-selling book, Remarkable Retail, and we cover a lot of ground reviewing the core principles of the first book, what has changed for the second edition written in the COVID era, and the big trends and 6 key forces in the post-COVID retail world you need to know to survive and thrive.
COVID has reset the playing field and introduced some new dynamics. So part of what I'm doing in the second edition is to update the context, the starting point, so to speak, because there was so much change. The other thing, too, which I think really made me feel like I had to update the book was part of what I was getting at, just to go back to kind of what I had in my mind when I was writing the first book was, as I said, these retailers that really need to transform.
So let's listen in now to my remarkable interview with Steve Dennis. Steve, welcome back to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing, my friend?
I am well. Thanks for having me back.
Well, you're certainly a familiar voice. We speak more than once a week, thanks to the Remarkable Retail podcast that we co-host. What a great experience I have with you on that. And I was trying to think, our last feature interview was January at the NRF in 2019, and you were kind enough to also join me on a panel I had for Black Friday. So it's been a while. So it's great to catch up. Thanks for coming on board.
You bet. Yeah, a lot's happened since then, I believe.
Yo, really?
Yeah.
Well, listen, as I said, you've been on the podcast a couple of times, and but just in case some of the listeners may not know of you or about you, why don't we start there? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Well, I'm Steve Dennis. I am a longtime retail executive. I've spent virtually all my career in retail. I did some big corporate consulting and a little bit of time in the food business, but really since the early 90s, I've been working pretty much exclusively in the retail industry. The first 15 years or so of my career was on the operating side, way back when at Sears, where I held a bunch of different roles, and then at the Neiman Marcus Group, where I was the chief strategy officer and head of multi-channel marketing and a few other things. And then for the last 10, 11 years, I've been I kind of think of myself as a retail renaissance man now because I do so many different fascinating things. But seriously, I do strategy consulting. I do keynote speaking. I write for Forbes. I've written this book we'll probably talk about, I imagine. And of course, the highlight of my life and career has been being co-host with you on the Remarkable Retail podcast.
It is a pile of fun. I really do enjoy our time together. So, the highlight of my weeks, because we have guests on, it's similar to different thing. You and I get to chat a bit different formats. So anyway, if anyone's hasn't checked that out, be sure and check that one out in your usual podcast platforms. Well, all right. Well, you mentioned it. You alluded to it. Let's get to the big news. You've got a second edition of your best-selling book, Remarkable Retail, coming out. Right now we're recording in early April. It comes out. You can pre-order it now if you're listening to this, or it's available on shelves on the 13th, I think, April 13th.
Yeah, the 13th in most markets. In the UK and a couple other markets, it's more, it's a couple weeks later. But for the most part, April 13th is the release date.
Before we talk about the second edition, again, not assuming everyone who's listening has read the book, let's talk about the first book. So in it, you kind of, you look at core principles and observations, and you set forward a framework. And let's start there. Tell us about the first book, and then tell us about particularly the 8 Essentials framework, because that really sets the tone for, I think, a lot of the way you think and approach strategic opportunities and risks and evaluations. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So when I think about who the first book was for, it's really for almost anybody in the retail industry. Whether it's retailers or people working with retailers, serving retailers, investing in retail. It's a pretty broad strategy book. But who it's for the most, the group of people I had in my head as I was writing it, was really those brands that need to significantly transform for a new age. And I would say the main premise of the book is really this idea that even very good is no longer good enough, because what digital disruption broadly and e-commerce did in particular was make product availability, access, information, pricing, all those things became very much abundant. And you really couldn't leverage the historical advantages of retail, which, might be exclusive product or a really great location or being the only game in town and all those kinds of things. So that's really driven the need for retailers to be more remarkable, to really distinguish themselves in a very powerful way. Because if you're essentially selling what amounts to a commodity and everything's about convenience and low price, you're probably going to get beaten by the internet 9 times out of 10. The second premise, I would say, which gets a little bit to why I did the second edition. The second premise was that I think most retailers that are struggling or edging toward a period where they might be struggling really underestimate the degree of change or transformation, whatever you want to call it, that is required and how quickly it needs to be done. So I really wanted to both encourage folks to think more radically about what they needed to do, as well as hurry, basically. And so the first part of the book kind of, sets out that premise, talks about some of the key trends, dynamics that are going on that I think are important to understand before you start thinking about what it means to initiate the journey to remarkable. And then the second part's got this 8 essentials framework, which hopefully provides a good roadmap or way of thinking about your business and where you need to improve, to close competitive gaps or distinguish yourself further.
Right. I mean, what I loved about the, as I thought about Remarkable Retail, what I loved is your jumping off point, even for the naming of the book. And in other words, you took a page out of your friend and colleague Seth Godin's idea about, will people remark upon you? In other words, is your brand worthy enough to be shared amongst each other? Just say, hey, I had a great experience at, or does it just fall away and just become this massive okayness, which I guess 20, 30 years ago you could get away with because there's certainly less internet and less availability, and a lot of these things, you could just get through, you could get by, but those days are gone. And if you're not doing any of those, and then we broke down together on the Remarkable Retail podcast season 1 the 8 essentials. So we don't need to go into them in any depth, but actually I'd encourage anybody who wants to delve in. That's a great resource. But tell me, of the 8 essentials, there are some that we would call table stakes. In other words, everybody's got to do them.
Right.
And you'll probably get to parity with others who are doing similar things. But there's a couple that stand out and stood out in my mind that are really differentiators. Like, if you got to do all these, but you really got to nail these. And if you nail these, it could move you farther and faster along this path of being remarkable. What are those 2 that you would highlight or that you thought of as those real drivers, those real difference makers?
Yeah, so they're number 7 and number 8, and actually they tie back. I hadn't actually thought about it until this exact moment, how they tie to what I just said earlier. So number 7, memorable, really ties to, in some respects, this need to be remarkable. What you're saying about the point that Seth made, and I would really encourage people to go back and listen to his TED Talk, which I think was from 2004 maybe, and read his book Purple Cow, which was 2003 perhaps. But it was this idea that in an ever noisier world where you have lots of choice, that you've got to do something to stand out. His way of talking about it was to be the purple cow amidst all the the herd of rather average brown cows. And I think memorable is the one that gets to that. What do you do? How do you do something that is intensely customer relevant, very unique, really tied to your brand, but has a wow factor or a series of wow factors that cause you to really be engaged with that brand in a powerful way, very loyal, but as you just mentioned, to literally talk about it. Because what Seth, really talked about was this idea that, first of all, if you can't break through the noise and the clutter, you basically are ignored. And if you're ignored, eventually you become irrelevant. But the flip side of that is if you have a story that people want, that you want to share and that people are compelled to share, then that's the best marketing. And that's the thing that really helps brands go to that next level. So that's memorable. And number 8 is radical. And radical, what I often say is adopting a culture of experimentation, becoming fundamentally more agile, being willing to make mistakes, but pivot quickly, et cetera. that's, first of all, just what I think is required and has been required for a while in today's day and age. But that's one of the ways you get to be remarkable if you aren't. And building that habit of innovation is the way that you stay remarkable. So it's an element, going back to what I said, the second premise was, you're going to have to change more than you probably think you do, and you're going to have to change more quickly. And I think building that culture of experimentation and that innovation muscle is really the heart of what you need to do to differentiate yourself.
And what I like about the model is it grounds some pretty big thinking, strategic thoughts that we all have to make about running the business in that simple, will people tell their friends about us? Like it's like a litmus test or a touchstone. Of course, behind that is tremendous amount of work and innovation and thought, but that ultimately boils down to, will people talk about us, or will we just be forgotten? Like, that old, like, people don't speak ill of us. They just don't speak of us at all.
Right.
Which is almost worse, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's fast forward. So your first edition came out in and around February of 2019, which meant you wrote it a little bit earlier now. So a bit has happened since then, the COVID era. Is that what kind of got you to start thinking about second edition? And tell us about the second edition. What's different from the first one?
Well, actually, just a quick correction. It came out almost exactly a year ago today, but it was so it came out just really as the world was going into COVID lockdown.
Wow. Yeah.
And but I finished writing it several months before, so COVID was certainly not on the mind. So the book did actually quite well reviewed, won some awards. So it wasn't a matter of not proud of the first edition of the book, but clearly COVID has reset the playing field and introduced some new dynamics. So part of what I'm doing in the second edition is to update the context, the starting point, so to speak, because there was so much change. The other thing too, which I think really made me feel like I had to update the book, was part of what I was getting at, just to go back to kind of what I had in my mind when I was writing the first book, was, as I said, these retailers that really need to transform. I would say generally, and retail is a big industry, and companies sit in all sorts of different competitive situations. But I would say, if I was just thinking about one set of retailers that I was trying to motivate, or people that are looking at the industry, help them understand it, it was, okay, you've got to make all these changes, but maybe you have 2, 3, 4 years to do it. Like if they were already dead, there's no point in writing the book, no matter how good the advice is. Like, it's not going to matter, right? So if you can't practically apply it, then it's not a very useful book. So I kind of had that idea in my mind. Well, COVID really accelerated that, say, 3 to 4 year time frame to 3 to 4 months, maybe. So a lot of retailers that were in trouble, have gone bankrupt or have closed a ton of stores, or, really hanging on the edge at this point and are kind of dead brands walking, as I talk about in the book. So I really had to kind of bring that all forward and kind of reset the starting point. And then, also just deal with some of the particular things that came out of COVID.
Did it change, did it being COVID change any of your conclusions or your insights, particularly from your thinking that went into the first edition?
It didn't really. There's an aspect, and I think we may have talked about this on the Remarkable Retail podcast. There was an aspect where I was like, well, I told you so. Like, if you were vulnerable, and, that's not, other than like beating my chest about that, that's not helpful, right? So I had actually, I think, validated for me a lot of the points that I've been making over the years, not just in the book, but in consulting and speaking. The two things I think that were in there, but I think really got amplified, were that the need to be agile. I think that's been important. Lots of people have talked about agile business models and so forth. But I think it just really, really emphasize the point that the world is just fundamentally more dynamic. And if you didn't believe it before, then COVID really taught you that. And I think the other part is that, and again, I talk about this in the first edition, but the pace of change is accelerating. And one of my favorite quotes is, which was from Carlos Castaneda's book, Journey to Ixtlan, is the problem is you think you have time, right? I mean, I think a lot of retailers just think like, okay, well, I don't have to do this until it's convenient or until we study it. more. And again, I make that point in the first edition, but in the second edition, I think I hit much harder on that. And again, I think if people don't get that by virtue of what happened with COVID, then I don't know what to say about it at this point.
Yeah. Right. Well, let's talk about current events a little bit. There was recently in the news, a company said, we think there's going to be 80,000 stores closed. And it's funny, Brendan Witcher, our guest on Remarkable Retail, said that's just clickbait. It's just nonsense. But ultimately, I think there will be, store closures. Do you see that as the inevitable impact of the COVID year? I mean, there's winners or losers for no fault of their own. Good landlord, bad landlord. They sell apparel. Some things are a little out of your control. Some things are not. Is store closures the rise of e-commerce, or is there something else going on if you're closing a lot of stores?
Well, with regard to that particular story, I just had a little bit of a Twitter exchange on this. I can't really get my head around what the number should look like, but I can tell you the methodology or the assumptions that went into that are really faulty. So I'm willing to say that I don't think there will be anywhere near that number of closures. But the U.S. in particular, but some other markets, has been very, very over-retailed for more than a decade. So a certain amount of this was inevitable, but low interest rates and some other dynamics kind of kept some of these folks afloat. So
now, what made it inevitable? Like inevitable, as in there's too many stores and e-commerce takes a bigger piece of the pie, or there's just too many doors fighting for the same dollar. What drives that inevitability?
Well, I think the inevitability had to do with a couple things. One is just the massive expansion of real estate square footage over a 20-year period relative to spending. It got very, very misaligned. And that by itself has nothing to do with e-commerce. The other part is that a lot of that space was or is in regional malls, which have been falling out of favor for a long period of time. So a harsh reckoning was inevitable. I think that COVID has made it happen. Well, and in some ways it hasn't made it happen more quickly because there's been so much government stimulus that I think we've yet to see it. But I think that what will happen, late this year, early next year will be pretty dramatic, and it will really get supply kind of better in line with demand. E-commerce certainly is a bit of a contributor, but mainly in that those brands that are poorly differentiated, going back to the point I made earlier, is if you used to be able to only get certain products from certain physical retailers, like that was the whole competitive world. Well, now that you can get products from anywhere, and in many cases get the cheapest product and delivered it to your home, those retailers that have physical stores that don't add any real value, they become irrelevant. So from that standpoint, e-commerce has forced certain types of retailers either out of business or to close more stores. So e-commerce, generally speaking, is a contributor to obliterating certain formats. And then I would say, in general, because of the endless aisle and omnichannel retail and so forth, there's certainly some companies that can do the same amount of business without as many stores or with somewhat smaller stores. So that all adds up to a big contraction in retail space. But what I think UBS gets wrong, and what is often wrong in the retail apocalypse narrative is, and you and I have talked about this a million times, is the role of stores in supporting an e-commerce business. So lots of these stores will remain because they will be there as brand advertising. They will be there as fulfillment centers, return centers, et cetera. So that doesn't mean that, in some cases, it will be stores that will get retrofit to that function. In other cases, they may get relocated because as they perform more of a fulfillment role, it might make sense not to be in the same real estate. But right. I think
when you need to pay the same rent if you're a drop-off location for returns online, you don't need to pay high street rent.
Right. But I think the UBS analysis fundamentally misunderstands that there are plenty of retailers that are growing their store footprints to offset some of the closings, and that the role of the stores is actually, it's a way too black and white analysis of, if e-commerce grows, therefore,
if X stores. Then Y.
Yeah, which is just, I think it's just obviously wrong. Like, I don't even, at this point, I think it's just incredibly, incredibly misguided.
Let's pull on that thread though a little bit, because recently there's been some stores for strategic, not financial reasons, or brands, I should say, that have closed their stores. I'm thinking Disney, and even before COVID, Bose, Microsoft, kind of on the edge, started to close their stores. And we also see brands taking advantage on the other end of the spectrum of real estate that's available, rushing to opening or at least planning stores. Who's right in all that?
Well, as a general rule, I would say if you are a brand where your physical presence is important to kind of being the kind of full representation of your brand, it's not just about e-commerce transactions, then you're going to need a store strategy. So it's a little bit mystifying to me with the Boses and the Disneys and I think Godiva, where that in-store experience seems to be pretty important to acquiring customers, getting more of their share of wallet, marketing the brand in a way that's very different than you can do in digital advertising and those kinds of things. Now, that doesn't mean that their particular store strategy was the right one, or they couldn't do with fewer stores, perhaps. But getting completely out of physical retail and thinking you're going to be able to drive your brand and rely on e-commerce, it seems to me like there's not a lot of evidence that works. There's plenty of evidence that when people close stores, their e-commerce business actually gets worse if they are more, higher end differentiated products.
Well, and some of them baffle me a little bit, like the Bose, for example, because I remember in my local mall, it's a nice mall, and you'd go by the Bose store, and I'd always pop in, and I have to say I often didn't buy that day, but then I'd say there's some new Bose stuff there, and you'd have a listen and stuff, and then it was at least in your consideration set. I'm going to get my TV needs a better speaker. I'd think of Bose. Now I don't even think of Bose anymore.
Well, it's certainly
reason.
Not easy to measure the advertising role of stores. If you get out of retail, now, some of these brands have wholesale partners, right? So they haven't necessarily totally gotten out of the ability to see a product.
I'm sure I can go see Bose at my local Best Buy, for example.
Right. So, you have to look at how much distribution do you really need and the economics of that. Yeah. But I absolutely think that this idea that you're going to not only have top of mind awareness, but you're going to have customers like really fully appreciate why they pay a premium price for a product, like whether we're talking about Bose or Godiva or whatever. Sure. And you're going to be able to do that through just being on Best Buy's website in the search function, or having to spend and compete for keywords and SEO. Like that's not, digital advertising is not really brand building, right? Yeah. And brand preference building. So I think it's a really misunderstanding of dynamics.
It also makes me sanguine about malls because, I'm sure I could go see, and I don't mean to pick on Bose, but they're a pretty good example. I'm sure I could see a great Bose set up at Best Buy, but that's a destination for me. Mm-hmm. Versus I'm walking, in a mall to go to place. So the impulse, the kind of accidental, the kind of inspiration shopping. Back in the late 90s, there was a Time magazine article, a very famous one, talked about the disintermediation of retail. E-commerce is going to wipe out retail because it wasn't necessary. People would just go buy direct from the brands, and retail's core function was being ameliorated. And that didn't come to pass in the past 20 or 25 years. But now 20% of e-commerce, if not more, of core is now that. Could that now happen? Was that prediction too early? Is that biggest risk to retailers their vendors?
Well, I think that is a risk. A lot of people, Mark Andreessen, I think in 2013 or whatever, said, the only retailers that'll be around will be pure play online retailers. Mm-hmm. And, we're not remotely close, even with COVID, like we're not at all remotely close to that. So, I think that there is kind of this, aside from what we were talking about, like the role of physical stores in terms of fulfillment and, that sort of thing. I think consumers in certain cases really value the in-person experience because they want to, put outfits together or sit on that sofa, mm-hmm. or try to figure out, well, why is this particular thing twice as much money? And, does it fit me? So there's a whole bunch of reasons or circumstances where physical retail adds a lot of value. And I think we can certainly see this, like, in the home improvement industry, there's a lot of digitally influenced sales, and there's certainly some home delivery and some small items, but lumber is probably not a great e-commerce business, right? So there's just lots of categories where I think brick and mortar will be not necessarily the way the sale is rung up, but will play a critical role. So e-commerce penetration will continue. I think again, people quote different numbers, but we're at about 20%. But a lot of that 20% is actually stuff that's bought online, but the store is involved in terms of fulfilling it. So that's a whole other, probably separate podcast about that. So, e-commerce is going to continue its penetration, but I don't see us getting to 50%, much less 100%, anytime soon. And as it comes to the disintermediation, I think, there's a lot of incentives for brands to go direct to consumer.
Right. Because it doesn't even have to involve stores. Like this could be not even a physical store discussion. This could be, why would I go to any of the retailers' websites to buy when I could go directly to the vendor site to buy?
Right.
And that's a legitimate question, but is it as big a risk as people seem to make out, or what's your perspective on that?
Well, I think when it comes to multi-category, multi-line retailers, whether we're talking about like Dick's Sporting Goods or Neiman Marcus or The Bay or whatever, I think some of that is convenience driven, which is, where can I go see this product? So to your earlier point, sometimes like I'm in the mall and I'm just going to go pop in, right, to check it out. Other times it's a destination, and maybe I'm going out to the grocery store.
I'm in the Bay. I'm in Hudson's Bay, and I go to Florida 5. I go to Beauty, and then I go upstairs to see what they got in housewares.
Right. So there's a convenience dimension that's, sometimes it's super convenient just to get online and have the box show up at your house, right? But other times you're out doing other things, and it's convenient to just, walk down to the next store or whatever. So I think there's a convenience dimension and immediate gratification dimension, which is important to stores. But I think when it comes to manufacturers' brands, sometimes people want to go to Dick's Sporting Goods because and I'm just picking that as an example, because they want to get some running shoes and socks and some shorts, right? And they're not necessarily super brand specific, right? In other cases, it's like, well, I really want Nike stuff and I want to see all the Nike stuff. and so I go directly to the website, or I go to the Nike store. So I think retail is very, very complicated. And a lot of times the problem with some of these broad statements is you're talking about an entire industry, and there's a lot more nuance to it. And what I often say, particularly in my consulting world, is, averages aren't particularly happy to a given competitor. Like, I don't, talking about the growth of online, if you've been in the off-price retail business, was kind of a non-factor, because there was very little that was done online. If you're
still is in some ways, right? In Canada, your big players in that aren't online today. It's a physical shop.
Right. And then the flip side, if you talk about books or music or whatever, like, okay, well, that's like 70% online, right? So averages aren't particularly helpful to a given retailer or even a given person in a category thinking about their strategy. So what I try to do in the book, and just in general in my work, is try to say, okay, well, let's separate the facts from the fiction here, maybe dispel some myths, but let's bring this down to the level of strategy and operations for your particular situation.
Well, speaking of that, it's a great segue to my last couple of questions. One of them is you've got this idea of the 6 forces. Your 8 essential model is in place, but you've now thinking about 6 forces that the COVID era has brought with us, and not short term, but these things that people need to be thinking about and you write about. Talk about those 6 forces, what you're thinking. So
the first one I call retail bifurcation 2.0. So, I get a lot of crap for this, but talking about retail's great bifurcation, but it's this general idea that the middle of the market has been collapsing, but success has been found at kind of either end of a spectrum, the value, convenience, dominant assortment spectrum, Amazon, Walmart, Costco. Other end of the spectrum, either luxury or more finely focused specialty concepts. So there's this kind of death in the middle. And I think, kind of touched on this earlier, I think bifurcation 2.0 is really, really just hammering those retailers that are stuck in the middle. Like there's very little room left to survive. Again, as I said earlier, I think this has been masked in the U.S. largely because of so much stimulus. But I think when the stimulus comes off, we'll see the pace of store closings and bankruptcies in that mediocre middle really increase. The second one is, I danced around calling it the Great Acceleration because our friend Carl coined that, and I didn't want to have to pay him a royalty, but it's an accelerating acceleration, and partly I say that is because I make the point elsewhere in the book that pace of change, whether it's technology or consumer preferences, has been accelerating for years, but COVID really just kind of amplified it to a new level. So that's the penetration of e-commerce, that's the adoption of technologies like contactless payment, appointment shopping, virtual personal shopping appointments, so that sort of stuff. So most technologies that were already kind of in play or nascent got jump started. In some cases, 1 year, in some cases 5 years. The third one is really this reallocation of spending, some of it driven by what we consider to be essentials. So the most obvious one there is how groceries just exploded at the expense of dining out, but also a lot of things around work from home. Whether that's like literally I'm working from home, so I need office supplies, office equipment, or I'm at home a lot that it's time to get that new sofa or get a Peloton or, things that are very much driven by how much time we're spending at home. I think this will, I probably at some point going to coin the phrase the great moderation, because I think we will see a deceleration. But certainly if you look at the fortunes of retailers and category spending across the last year or so, we've seen some really big distortions. The fourth one is really this kind of consolidation of power, kind of the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. And by this, I mean, I think it's both in terms of retailer brands that were very well positioned, had a remarkable value proposition, gaining share from either brands that are going out of business or closing a lot of stores. Their market share has to go somewhere and tends to go to the stronger players. Same kind of thing on the real estate front, right? With shopping centers closing, malls closing. Again, that business, even if it had been declining over time, that business is going to go elsewhere. So I think we'll see a lot of market share consolidate to the stronger players. And we're also seeing, and we'll see more of it, of these bigger players buying up, not necessarily weaker players, but perhaps companies that got into trouble because of too much debt or whatever. And so they can pick up brands, use their strong balance sheet, their cash to pick up brands.
Pick up the people too, right? The brands and the people.
Yeah, brands, customer lists, talent, technology, real estate, you name it. There's lots of plays. So I think there's really going to be this kind of contraction or consolidation among the stronger players, broadly speaking. The fifth is the great rewiring, and this is a term I took from Rashad Tabakawala, and he talks about how COVID has really just fundamentally changed the way we shop, the way we dine, the way we are educated and work, and so forth. So, and this is the one where I think it's harder to know the degree to which this rewiring will persist. I think the work from home one is the one that's probably the most profound over time. And when you think about that, not only does that dictate what you spend your money on, but also, is there more shopping? Yeah, right. Are there more people, more retail restaurants in the suburbs relative to urban cores? Those sort of things could be pretty significant, and that's got implications for real estate prices and a whole bunch of other things. And then the last one quickly is, but it's actually the one that I'm kind of most jazzed about, is what I'm calling the hybridization of retail. And again, like a lot of things I talk about in the book, some of these things have been going on for a while, and people are just, they've either been accelerated or amplified, or in some cases, people are just like waking up to the reality that they didn't see before. But I think, as we talked about earlier, retail stores, which are basically designed to be places for people to go and buy things, are really serving a more hybrid role. We talked about the marketing role of it. I think that's becoming more obvious. Fulfillment of e-commerce orders from store stock, curbside pickup, service centers, return centers, all these kinds of things I think will change the nature of a given physical store pretty considerably over time. And I think it will also lead to a different way of deploying your different formats, because you may have, if you're a grocery store, you may have the dark stores that are doing just fulfillment, so you can keep stores just being consumer only, or ghost kitchens. There's a lot of things going on here where new formats or maybe formats that were around are getting reimagined and maybe aggressively rolled out. So a lot of hybrid, virtual, digital, but also I think the role of physical retail is pretty significant.
Well, the book is Remarkable Retail, and no matter when you're listening to this, it's available. If you're listening to it in mid-April, you can get it on pre-order, but soon, no matter where you are in the world, you'll be able to buy it. So I encourage everyone to do it. It's a fantastic book. We're going to give a couple away. So thank you, Steve. You've given me a couple, 3 books to give away. So we'll have a fun promotion that I'll have linked in or connected into the show notes. So check out that. We're going to give a couple of books away just to share the wisdom, so to speak. Thank you. Very generous. And again, a quick thing. We've got an event coming up. You've got a book launch coming up. I say we because I'm hosting. I have the pleasure of hosting. Talk about that for 30 seconds. That's happening on
Tuesday the 13th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's a 1-hour event, which will include myself, surprisingly, and you. We're also going to have
also not surprisingly,
Sucharita Kodali, Forrester analyst who was kind enough to write the foreword to the second edition, Seth Godin, and several other people. So we'll be talking about the book. We'll be talking about what's next for retail, and taking some questions. And so I imagine you might be able to put the link in the show notes. And I'm also, if you follow me on social media, at Stephen P. Dennis on Instagram and Twitter, we'll have that information there as well.
That's great. I'll put the link for that. And for the listeners, it's a great opportunity to ask Steve the questions that you might have after listening to this interview. So it's a great opportunity. So Steve, thanks again for joining me on The Voice of Retail. It's great to hear your voice as always, and I wish you much continued success with the book and the launch of the book. It's already got such great momentum behind it, so congratulations on that, and thanks again for making time to chat.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of The Voice of Retail. Be sure and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on the latest episodes, industry news, and insights. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a rating and review, as it really helps us grow so that we continue to get amazing guests onto the show. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of LeBlanc Company Inc. And if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn. Visit my website at meleblanc.co. Until next time, stay safe and have a great week.